Lo yikruchu karcha berosham. One should not remove hair, create a bald spot on the head, on their heads. They're not permitted to destroy the corners of the face. This is the prohibition that a Jew is not permitted to use a straight blade, because you destroy the corners of your face. In last week's parsha, Rashi cites the Gemara that the 5 corners to the head, the 5 locations. Yigalecho giluach, the Gemara says, is considered not a cross cut, but rather you cut the hair at the root, and that's with a blade. And in the flesh, they should not create lacerations. We'll see in a moment. We're speaking about a person is grieving over somebody who died, and because the person is so beside himself and can't contain his grief, he starts pulling the hair out of his head, and he starts lacerating his body. If one does that, it's specifically for the dead, because the person cannot contain his grief, he's in violation. For every bald spot you create, you're in violation of likru kolcho, and for every laceration you make, you're in violation of lo yisru tu sarotas. You should not lacerate your flesh. Let's take a look at Rashi, and then we'll discuss it. Likru kolcho al mes. Specifically, you're creating this bald spot because you're pulling your hair out al mes to grieve over somebody who died. Why is this written specifically by a Kohen? Even a non-Kohen is not permitted. It says, an ordinary Jew, it says between your eyes. What does Beinei Nechem mean? It means specifically what corresponds to your eye. Maybe if you pull out hair from any other part of that, other than that is corresponds to between the eyes, you're not in violation. We find by the Kohen Berosham, anywhere on the head. And we learn the prohibition of an ordinary Jew from the Kohen. It says korcha hair creating this bald spot. Nemri b'sho korcho. Mat kan kol harosh is by the Kohen. It's anywhere on the head. Aflal kol harosh bashma. Kol mokshik rosh. And just as over the air by the Yisrael, it's specifically you're doing it because you're grieving over the dead. Afkan alames. So each one learns from the other. It's Beinei Nechem is not specifically between your eyes, it means anywhere. It means the top of the head. It starts there, but it goes the whole head, and specifically grieving for the dead. Okay, so therefore it's learned from Gzera Shava. Paskon ligalechu, lefisha nemar, in Parshas Kedoshim Bosashchis. It says you should not destroy the corner of your face. Yochel lokta b'malkit. What happens if a person took malkit? He took a tweezer and he started to pull out the hairs, which is not the way you normally remove hairs from the face. Ubrihitni yechayev, some kind of other type of, it's a plane, and you remove the hair that way, even though you're pulling it out from the root with the tweezer. It has to be the way one normally shaves, with a straight blade. Something that's called shaving. Pulling the hair, although the end result is the same, it has to be derech giluach. It's the way you normally would shave, and you're destroying the hair from the root. So therefore, if you use a depilatory, although the end result is the same, you're not in violation, because that's not called derech giluach. It's not the way one normally shaves. So destroying the corners of your face is not based on you're doing it because it has to do with the grieving for the dead. Removing the hair from the head creating the bald spots or lacerating itself, that's specifically for the mess, because the person can't contain his pain. It says you should not create a laceration. Maybe a person creates 5 lacerations, you're only in violation of one negative commandment. For every laceration, you're in violation. This word is superfluous to learn this point. If I tell you not to make a laceration, the result of a laceration, you're lacerated. So what is it? So rotas to tell me you're in violation for every one of them. Okay. In Dvorim, where it speaks about creating the bald spot, person cannot create his grief because it's just too much for him to deal with. He starts tearing at his flesh and he starts pulling the hair out of his head. So over there, the pasuk mentions 2 things. It mentions that we are kadosh, Jewish people are holy, and ani Hashem Elokechem, and I am your God. Why, when a person, God forbid, dies, a beloved one, why is a person so consumed and subsumed with his grief? Because he feels, for one of 2 reasons. Either he feels he's abandoned, the person who died abandoned him, and he's all left by himself, or he's concerned for the person who passed away. The person who died, what's his predicament? So the Sifar over there explains both of these points in the pasuk. In terms of the person who passed away, you don't have to be concerned for him because he's in a better place. Because since you are kadosh, since the Jewish people are holy, when a person leaves this world, he's in a location which there's nothing comparable to that location in terms of his relation with Hashem. And if you're concerned that you're abandoned and you're left bereft, and the Hashem Elokechem, one doesn't have a father more than Hashem. Whatever the human relationship is, it pales compared to what Hashem is to us and what his concern for us, his love for us. So if you cannot contain yourself, it's a reflection that you don't feel secure with Hashem, that Hashem is not who he is. Therefore, the Jew is not permitted to lacerate himself, which he takes a piece of pottery and starts tearing at his flesh, and he starts pulling the hair out of his head, because both this behavior pattern is an indication either he's concerned for the person who died or himself, that he feels abandoned and bereft for that reason. Therefore, there's a prohibition to do either of these actions, to pull out the hair from your head or to tear at your flesh, which is the laceration. Rabbi Shol Salanta had 3 special students. One of them had married a widow who had children. And he had, after he was married, he had children from this woman, from this widow he married. He would treat his wife's children with greater sensitivity than his own children. Why? Because the Torah says, factually, his wife's children are orphans. And Hashem says, you have to treat an orphan very special. And Hashem says, and if you don't, I will react to that level of mistreatment. So because of that, because Hashem is taking over. If there's no mortal father, Hashem takes over, he's the father. And he's specifically sensitive to the way you treat that child. So he would be more sensitive to his wife's children than his own children that he had with his wife for that reason. So as well as you treat the orphan, you have to be extra careful because he's an orphan. It's not just because he has no one to take care of him and he's like subject to abuse, like the convert is subject to abuse. And that's why we had last week, there's an extra lav that you're not permitted to aggrieve a ger. a convert for that reason. In addition to the mitzvah, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, you must love your brother as you love yourself. There's an additional mitzvah, it's called Avos Hager. You must love the convert. Because naturally, since he comes from a different background, you don't have that natural love for him. And the Rambam says, based on that when you show that love and concern for the convert, you're fulfilling two positive commandments. Because he's a Jew. In addition, because he's a convert, and you're treating him with that love, in addition, you fulfill that second mitzvah, I say. But again, if you abuse him, if you aggrieve him, Hashem says, I will react. I will react to it. So the Sefarno explains that if a person behaves this way, pulls the hair out of his head, or starts tearing at his flesh because he can't contain his grief, his pain, you're in violation of what? Of the negative commandment and the positive commandment. The Gemara says something interesting. Ernie, I always say, is an expert in Makos. The Gemara says in the third parak in Makos that if you take a depilatory, or you take a piece of pottery and you tear at your flesh, and you have in mind, I'm grieving over the 6 million Jews who are murdered in the Holocaust. You do one action. Lo yistru soretas means, the Gemara, Rashi is citing only part of it, that for every laceration, you're in violation of negative commandment. What about if you do one laceration, and the one laceration is done for multiple people that you're grieving over? That one action is the equivalent of multiple lacerations. So the Gemara says, as many people who you have in mind when you lacerate yourself, even one action, you're in violation of multiple negative commandments for that one action. And the person would be subject to multiple sets of malchus for that one action. A Nazir, when he drinks wine, the Mishnah says in malchus, for every revius of wine he drinks, and they warn him, every revius he drinks, he's subject for each revius. For every measure of wine he drinks, because he's violating his nazirus. When it comes to this other thing, this other area, in terms of expressing your pain, one action has the value of multiple actions, and therefore the person is subject to multiple sets of malchus based on the number of times he violated that negative commandment. Bring it up again. I want to respond to it. Ernie.
That a person taking their own life, God forbid, is the ultimate in cutting yourself, I would think.
No, it's not cutting, but it's conception. Same thing. Right. Person can't deal with life. It's too much, can't deal with it. And that's why he figures the easy way out, he's just gonna end it. That's the idea. A person who's lacerates himself, God forbid, if a person died, a close person, as I said, it's one of two reasons. What is he going to do without that person? How is he going to survive without that person? That it demonstrates that lack of belief, or what he's grieving for the person who's no longer here. What's going to be with him? So both reasons are not sufficient, because Hashem is the father of the person. He no longer has a parent, or the parent is no longer here, is in a better place. When a person, God forbid, takes his life, that person says, I can't deal with it any longer. That's it, he can't. God gave him more than he could deal with. He can't deal with it. So what is the solution? Just end it. So you don't have to deal with all those issues any longer. It's a different, it's touching upon a different thing. But there's a famous Kassam Sofer, the halacha is, God forbid, person commit suicide, he's buried in a different part of the cemetery. Of course, there's something, it's very, very extreme, very severe if a person, God forbid, takes his life. However, he shows that unless a person, it's proven beyond any doubt that the person was rational when he took his life, the person is classified as an unstable person. And he shows it, he sources it, the Chassam Sofer, because no stable, sane person, exact for what you're saying, is going to take his life. So the only reason why a person takes his life, because at that moment, he became totally irrational to the point that he wasn't stable. Therefore, since he's unstable, a person is not liable for his behavior, for his actions. Therefore, he's not classified as a Russia for taking his life. Therefore, that person, you bury him in the cemetery. That's the Chassam Sofer. There was a case when I was a young boy. There was a person who had a candy store across the street from the yeshiva. I'm talking in the 50s. And he was a Holocaust survivor. And he himself lost his family in Europe. And he was here. And financially, he was in terrible shape. He had all kinds of problems, illnesses, losing children. It was a disaster. And he wrote a letter. You hear this? It's not to be believed. In blood, he took his blood and wrote a letter, a suicide letter, that he can't deal with it. And he was very specific exactly what he was doing, why he was doing it. And that's why he's taking his life. That's it. He had enough. He's checking out. And remember, in those years, the Tug Morning Journal, in the 50s, many Jews read the Jewish paper. And they published that note, that suicide note, in the Yiddish newspaper. It was terrible. I remember I was a child. It was like so almost hearing what happened was enough to, that you need some kind of level of therapy. Because the man, we used to go and buy candy in this candy store right across the street, this man. And he looked like a Holocaust survivor. He was poor and he looked like he had all the wounds of the war. He wore it on his face. And then next day he's not there. Why? Because today they bring in a team of psychologists and therapists, and they give you off from school for about 3 months, and then you do school remote. That's what they would do today. They should be holy for their God. They should not desecrate the name of their Hashem. Because Eishi Hashem, that's burnt in the fire, it's talking about the sacrifices, which is Lechem Elokeim, which is the bread of their God. They are sacrificing, therefore Vayu Kodesh. Therefore, they must behave at a higher level of Kedusha. Okay? Because they were chosen to have that relation with Hashem, their level of behavior has to be different than the ordinary Jew. We said in terms of contamination, in terms of, we'll see, in terms of who they could marry. Therefore, for them, it's called a chilul. They're desecrating their children. A Kohen marries a woman he's not permitted to marry, a divorcee, a woman's defiled. The child is not a Kohen, although the pedigree is Kohen, the father's a Kohen. It's called a cholo. It says lo yichalel zaro. He's desecrating his progeny, his seed. Kedoshim yiyu. Al korchom yagdishim bezdin bekach. Let's say Kohen wants to abdicate his kuna. Wants to abdicate it. Can't abdicate it. As a Jew, the Gemara says in Kedushin, Yisrael pi shechoti Yisraelu. A Jew, even if he becomes, God forbid, an apostate, he says, I'm willing to give it all up. I don't want to be recognized as a Jew. It's irrelevant. You are who you are. You can't change that reality because a Jew has a Jewish soul, regardless how behave, that has nothing to do with who you are. A Kohen innately is holy because he's Zara Shel Aaron, because he's from the seed of Aaron. And as long as that seed initially, when he was conceived as a Kohen, he's always a Kohen. Therefore, the court actually imposes on him the restrictions and all the behavior patterns of what a Kohen is. He's not permitted to violate that. Al Korchom. Now, this is important. The Gemara tells us that a Torah scholar, the Torah says, we just had last week's Parsha, you have to acknowledge the presence of a person who's a Zokain. What's Zokain? Ein Zikna al Mishakol Chochma. Person who's a Talmud Chochem, you have to acknowledge him. But Dartim things okay. So the Gemara says, even though that's true, but Gemara says in Kedushin that Talmud Chochem Shemochel Kvod Kvod Umochu, that a Torah scholar who chooses to waive his honor, he has a right to waive his honor. Why? It's based on a pasuk in Tehillim, because we find that the Torah is called Torah Hashem in the first parak of Tehillim, and then David says, "Ubetorasa yegibel yom v'loylo," and the person who studies in his own Torah, he engages day and night. So first it's Torah Hashem, then it refers to it as Torah. So it's the Torah belonging, like it's his personal asset. So the Gemara says that after the person studies the Torah, it's considered his. Therefore, Talmud Chacham has a right to waive his honor. So we mentioned the earlier responsive right that even though Talmud Chacham has a right to waive his honor, but to disgrace himself, he's not permitted. To put himself in the disgraceful state, because that's more than waiving honor. You're disgracing what you represent. To behave in a way where you're disgracing the Torah you possess, that you're not permitted. So here the Sephorno says similar. A Kohen has a right to waive his honor. Right? You're supposed to acknowledge a Kohen, give him the first, he should be the one to bench. He should have the first pick. But if he says it's okay, I'm willing to waive it, he has a right to waive it. But what about a Kohen who wants to disgrace what his representation? That is not permitted. And that's what the Sephorno says over here in Vav, if you have the Sephorno. Although all this, the way we're treating him, it's all for his honor, because of what he represents. In this area, he has no right to waive this. Because the reason why the Torah says you have to acknowledge the Kohen as being holy and special is because that's God's honor. That's God's honor. And if they waive this, Yimchol al Shmo, they're actually desecrating his name. This already is desecration. In this area, he has no right to waive this. That's what he says. And when you Yimcholu al Zeh, Yechalu Shmo, and that you have no right. They're not in a position to waive that, because it's not theirs. That's crossing the line. Same thing with Talmud Chacham. There's honor. You don't want to stand for a person, fine. Slabotka, read about the background of different yeshivas in Europe, which was established, and everything there was set in place by the Alta of Slabotka, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zech Tzarek Livrocho. The whole, until he established that yeshiva, the way a Talmud Chacham was seen in Europe, he was looked down upon. He was seen as a person who maybe couldn't make ends meet, or wasn't qualified, wasn't bright enough. And this all had to do with the Haskalah movement, especially in Russia and Lithuania, because there the issues were Haskalah. Unless you go and you get the secular education, you're like an archaic Jew. So the Alta of Slabotka wanted to change that whole stereotype. So therefore, graduates of Slabotka, they would dress, the way they would talk, the way they would, the body language, the way they interacted with people was very sophisticated, and they were brilliant. The students of Slabotka, you weren't even eligible to go there unless you had a phenomenal mind and a retentive memory. And he elevated Kavod Torah. That was the whole idea. So Torah should be revered, not looked down upon. That was the idea. Person wants to waive it. And the result of waiving it is people are going to look down on Torah. That action, although you're waiving in that particular context, that's disgracing Torah. There was a story many years ago. There was a boy, young man, he must have been 20. He came from Milan, Italy. And he was a Chabadska. And he was very brilliant young man. And it was a known fact And the yeshiva wasn't that large. We had 180 students in the yeshiva. And my Rashiv Zichron Livrocha would sit up front, and he had a large stender, large lectern, and he would study himself. And people would come over to speak to him. And he sat in his chair, and you would speak to him. And, you would bend over and speak to him. But it was a known fact. You never approached my Rosh Yeshiva unless you wore a jacket. You never went over in shirt sleeves to speak to him, out of respect. You had to wear a jacket. This person came from Milan, is Chabadska, and they have their own way of seeing things in those days. And he was going to prove a point that he's going to speak to my Rosh Yeshiva, and he's going up in a sweater. And it's before the whole base medrash. Everybody's looking. He's going up, and it was unheard of. Nobody approached my Rosh Yeshiva wearing anything but a jacket, which was considered respectful. He was going to show, he's going to speak to my Rosh Yeshiva wearing a sweater. Telling you the story. He goes over with the Gemara, and he puts it on my Rosh Yeshiva Shtender. My Rosh Yeshiva is looking down, learning, and he stood there for a half an hour. My Rosh Yeshiva would not pick up his head, would not look at him. And of course, my Rosh Yeshiva knew he was standing there. He was going to prove a point that he's going to speak to my Rosh Yeshiva, although it's not in appropriate attire. If my Rosh Yeshiva would have allowed it, what is that? That's waiving honor, or that's allowing the Torah to be disgraced? That's a breach of honor. That's a breach. In that context, he has no right to waive his honor. Because this young man had a point to prove, and he was going to prove it. By this disrespect, that was a disrespect. The difficulty is it says, Kedoshim yu le'elokehem. You should not desecrate Elokehem. Say Elokim. Or Elokecho. Elokecho. Right? If we would say Elokecho, would it bother you as much? Lo yichal Hashem Elokecho. There is a personalization. A Jew is not permitted to be involved in Chil Hashem. A non-Jew could do it. There's no prohibition. It's because we have a relationship. Because of that relationship, crossing that line is considered desecration. The Kohen, it's Elokehem. It's the body of Kahuna. It's the group. It's not you as an individual. It's the group. You should not desecrate Shem Elokehem. They're referring to the Kohen. The Kohen has a special relation with Hashem, and that's why they were chosen to be the officiants. So therefore, because of the degree of intimacy and closeness you have, more than the ordinary Jew, therefore you cannot behave in a certain way, and you cannot cross certain lines. That's what's Elokehem. For that reason. It's something similar. The Eved Ivri, if after 6 years he says, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my child. They put the whole through with the all through his ear. Why? Because he has some kind of defective hearing. Because at Sinai, you heard, it says you shouldn't steal, or it says, Avodahem, you're my subjects, how to go sell yourself and say, I love my master. You only have one master. Same idea. But Hashem took you at Sinai, that you're his subject, and you're considered a prince. How do you sell yourself to a commoner? It's the same idea. Because of what happened at Sinai, we have a different level of relationship. And because of that, it's considered he has defective hearing for that reason. A woman who's a zona, that's a defiled woman, or chalola. She's the issue of a marriage which is not permitted. Her father's a Kohen, and her mother was a divorcee. Is she qualified to marry a Kohen? She's not qualified. She's classified as chalola. Isha grusha b'isha lo'ikochu. A woman who's divorced from her husband, a divorcee is not permitted to marry. Ki kodeshu leilakov. Because he's holy for his God. Again, leilakov. Was that Hashem chose him specially to be at that special level, Therefore, he's not permitted to marry these women. She's divorced. Now, the Gemara tells us at the end of Gittin, that God forbid if a man divorces, especially his first wife, HaMizbeach borid the Mos Olav. The Mizbeach cries. That's how tragic it is. We're not talking about, God forbid, a person, the woman wasn't stable or whatever it was. We're talking about, for whatever reason, he divorces his wife. In Judaism, when a man marries a woman, it's more than just two people being together. There's a bonding of souls. The neshama of the woman and the neshama of the man, they intermesh. The separation, now how are they separated? Because Hashem gave a mechanism, a procedure called a get. The get severs, and the Torah uses the word get krisus. That document cuts it. It cuts it right off. When a person dies, an almon is permitted to a Kohen. Because who brought about that separation? That Hashem separated it. When a human being separates it, and Hashem gives the person the ability to cut the relationship, to terminate it, it's called a get. So evidently there is some connection to the past. The Gemara says in Gittin, the Gemara says in Chulin, that Hashem gives everybody a certain ability to understand what's not permitted. And the Gemara says, if you want to know what pork tastes like, there's a certain kosher fish that if you eat its tongue, you'll have an idea what pork tastes like. If you want to know what basam cholav tastes like, the Gemara speaks about broiling the udder of a cow with the milk in the udder, where the milk was never taken out of the udder. It's very complicated Gemara. So although there's milk, it's milk and meat, it's permitted to eat. It's called kchal. You're permitted. You have an idea with basam cholav. If you want to have an idea, semblance of what adultery is, marry a divorcee. Why? Because a divorcee, her husband's still alive. Usually, very often still alive. And you're living with a woman who still has some connection to the past. That's a grusha. I'm just telling what the Gemara says. So therefore, you have a semblance of whatever it is, what that experience is. And almana, no, the husband's gone. Hashem took him. It's a whole different reality of the relationship. So because she's a grusha and she has that level of representation, there's a connection to the past. As a result of that, the Kohen's not permitted to marry her, only if she's a widow. She's defiled, something else. A woman was with a non-Jew, cohabited with a non-Jew. That woman's considered a defiled woman. She's not permitted to a Kohen. A woman, God forbid, she's a wife of a Kohen and she's raped against her will. She's a defiled woman. The Kohen has to divorce her. He's not permitted to be with his wife, even though it's not her fault. She was a victim. Doesn't make a difference. To be continued.